Out of the 1,000 or so international staff at NATO, given that Britain and France are the two European military member states, how many British staff are there? And given the debate about the underrepresentation of Britons in the EU institutions, is Britain overrepresented, underrepresented, or is the proportion of staff per member state is just about right in NATO?
You mean for the UK?
For the UK, yeah, by itself.
To be honest with you, I don't know. I can only give you my impression of what it was like in the Commission and here. I would say here maybe slightly overrepresented in NATO. And one of the reasons is that there's a heavy emphasis on English. The Americans are not really they're not how can I say this diplomatically? I work in the diplomacy division. English is an international language, and the Americans are very well aware of that, and even if they're coming to Europe or frankly many other parts of the world, they are more comfortable in English. So English is the language of NATO, even though French is officially an official language. There's really not that much practiced here. When I arrived in the Commission, it was more or less the opposite. French was the language you'd be sitting in meetings, and the language everybody would speak would be French. That's kind of changed as well, from what I understand, since I left. More and more English-friendly countries arriving. But in terms of representation, I would say, as I say, here there's a lot of Brits that I come across. I don't think we're underrepresented. I think the other thing is that in terms of NATO, if you're looking for people to actually do some of the heavy lift, in terms of 2% budget on defence, in terms of professional fighting forces, and in terms of forces that are available for expeditionary missions. In terms of Europe, I think you said it at the beginning, there's really only two countries, which is Britain and France. The other countries really aren't in a very good position to be leaders. And I think if you militarily, I'm talking about, and I think if you look at, for example, Afghanistan, it tells you a lot where different nationalities were posted. The Americans were obviously pretty much everywhere, but the Brits were in the south, Helmand, Kandahar. In other words, where the real fighting, I don't want to say the real fighting, but where the heavy fighting was happening, you probably want the Brits in there. And so, in terms of NATO, I think what we bring to the party is clearly recognised. We have a history of professional fighting forces. A lot of these countries had, and I think maybe one or two still have, military conscription. So that you spend a year, maybe two, as a young person. And some of these conscripts have actually been sent to missions. We never had that in the UK. We basically said you're either a professional soldier or you're not a soldier. And I think that helps a lot in the environment of a security organisation like here. In the EU, I think what's seen as more our strength is on the financial side. The City of London is very important. I remember the competition DG used to have a lot of Brits in it. So we have advantages there as well, although I wouldn't say so much as here. You've got to remember that NATO deals effectively with one subject. We deal with security. The EU deals with numerous subjects, and so we might be strong in one DG, less strong in another. There are DGs that are seen as more francophone, more of the people in their senior positions are French speaking, and then there are others that are seen a bit more anglophone, and that affects how the work is done. But in terms of actual concrete numbers, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. And from what I've always understood, and this may not be true anymore, but I certainly felt it was at the time. I never felt that there were quotas in terms of most of the posts that I was applying for. Unless it specifically said, this is for Greek-speaking Cypriot lawyers or things like that. Most of the time you'd be in with a fair shout. One of the biggest problems, just to finish on that point, one of the biggest problems that the Brits have themselves is that they don't speak enough foreign languages. And this really is, here you can get by because, as I say, the Americans are not renowned for... We do have one or two Americans who have bucked that trend, but most of them only speak English. And so you can get Brits who are similar. But in the EU, if you want to get it in, just to help yourself as much as anything else, you really need to be able to speak at least French. A lot of the documents, even if the people are speaking to you in English, a lot of the documents that will pass your desk will be in French. So if you can't speak French, then your chances of getting in, I suppose, and also doing well are limited.
Which should be greatly encouraged, really, in terms of languages.
Yeah, I think there is a lot. I mean, as I say, I lived in Spain and I've lived here, and so I speak Spanish and French, and I think it only helps you as a person as much as anything. But professionally, if you're in Brussels and you don't speak French, then your life is going to get a bit difficult. And there are Americans who've lived here for over a decade who refuse almost to learn. Not just Americans, I know a German who's done it as well, who refuse to learn French but speak very good English. To be honest with you, Brussels is changing more towards catering for them rather than them catering for living in Brussels. But I would say that yes, the Brits really need to help themselves more if they want to have more of an influence. I think they have a pretty good reputation in terms of the EU. I don't know so much here, but in terms of the EU, the British-led DGs and some of the British senior staff were very well seen and seen as very reliable, professional, etc. But these people all spoke foreign languages. I've seen people in London who are perhaps more capable but just don't speak any foreign languages, so they don't get here.
Would British NATO staff be affected in any way by a British withdrawal from the European Union, and if so, how?
Okay, well, just trying to think if there is effectively no. De jure no, but de facto yes. De facto because nearly all of our major bases, with the exception of the one in Norfolk in Virginia, are in Europe, are in the EU. And so it's a matter of physical location rather than anything else. Now, of course, that's surmountable. We have Turks working here, we have Albanians working here, we have Norwegian. None of these people are in the EU and they're working here. So it's not a deal breaker, but it's certainly a way of making things more difficult for the Brits, because then we're talking about living here with the if you get a resident permit, if it's EU, it's very easy. Same thing for 27 other countries, so they don't do it on an individual basis. But if you're doing it on an individual basis, that's going to slow everything down. So the resident permit, the passport, the visas for travelling everywhere. I'm sure there's going to be other major bureaucratic nightmares. I mean, my daughters, for example, were born here, and we've given them British passports since the beginning because myself and my wife are British. Now what happens? Are my daughters suddenly foreigners? I'm okay because I've got an Irish passport as well. My parents are Irish, so frankly for me, I just switch over to Irish and say, okay, well, I'm Irish now then. I can't be Irish in NATO because Ireland's not in NATO, but I can outside be. You see what I mean? It becomes
complicated.
It becomes a complete mess, and it will basically, that's the great thing about the EU, is like if there's 27 other countries, like let's do it once and let's do it simply, so that all these 27 other countries, right, there's something for you here. As soon as you start saying, well, it's 27, actually it's 26, but then there's this one special thing for these guys here, then you're going in with, like, as I say, the Turks, and it can even get more ridiculous than that. I mean, remember at passports sections when you arrive at an airport, EU passports, rest of the world. That's basically what we're looking at.
Mm.
Do you want to be in this queue, or do you want to be in the queue with people who may be Turks and Norwegians, but they could be Somalis and Afghans? You know, it's just basically you are not part of the EU. Nobody really cares whether you're the UK or whether you're Somalia. You're not in the EU, and that's the group you're joining. And so yes, it will make things much more difficult. Just bureaucratically, myself and my wife, we own a property here, we own a property in London. You know, one's already in euros, one's in pounds, but at least they're both in the EU. As soon as you start saying now they're in different jurisdictions, then it becomes even crazier. So the EU is really just a way of saying we can all communicate with each other in a common way, but as soon as you take yourself out of that, who knows? I mean, you know, who knows what the arrangements are with, I don't know, Afghanistan or Kyrgyzstan, or this is the kind of genre we're getting into, you know, saying, okay, which group do you belong to? We must remember that the world is going towards blocks. You have, I mean, quite apart from what's going to happen, looking at TTIP, which is, you may know, as a trade agreement between the US and the EU. That's basically saying not only have we got into major blocks, but we're going to do major things between those blocks. Major trade agreements, huge, going to cover everything from public health services through to GMOs. In Asia, ASEAN, if you look at Russia, setting up this Eurasian customs union. I mean, I don't think it's going to be very successful, but they understand that you know we're more powerful in a bloc. The African Union is doing the same. NAFTA is about doing a similar thing with North American Free Trade Association. The whole world is and has been for decades now moving towards the common sense conclusion that there is safety and power in numbers. And frankly, again, I cannot understand how 44% of the UK has not understood the direction the world is going in. And let me just give you one example, one perfect example to show you what did happen when there was an attack from a friendly country a few years ago when I was in the European Commission, and what would happen if we weren't in the EU. The United States, you know, we are the biggest trade bloc in the world, the EU. They've got the biggest economy in the world. So something's got to give if we have a bit of an argument. And the United States, during the time of, I think it was the first, maybe it was the second Bush presidency, decided to whack on some major tariffs onto EU steel. And that's not good, because basically they've got the biggest economy in the world, we've got all this steel to sell, and then they're basically saying, okay, American steel $10, EU steel $15. You know, it's obvious what's going to happen. Everybody's going to buy this and nobody's going to buy this. So we weren't very happy. I was working in the Commission at the time. We weren't very happy about this at all. And as you may recall, I don't know how old you were at that time, but basically the Bush presidency didn't really care what other people thought. So there was no sort of, hey, we're the two bastions of the free world, let's try and sort this out in a civilized way. It didn't really work. So what happened in the EU after protesting this to the American authorities and getting no response was the EU just said, okay, well, we're going to have to play the same game here, guys. And what they did was very clever. The bill that was going through their Congress that called for higher tariffs on EU steel was supported by, I remember one of the senators was from Florida, I think the other one was from Michigan. Anyway, so what the EU did was say, okay, what are the biggest exports from these places that these guys represent into the EU? And remember, the one in Florida was oranges. And they said, okay, so this guy represents these orange sellers, okay? Double tariffs on these oranges, on the whole state. And in Michigan, I think it was something to do with car parts. Again, double US car part tariffs. They're going to do it to us, we're going to do it to them. More importantly, we're not going to do it to everybody, we're just going to do it to the guys who are trying to screw us. We're going to screw you back now, okay? And in fact, you're going to get doubly screwed because we're the biggest single market in the world, okay? So when it comes to selling, there's nobody bigger than us. And what we're going to do now is make you suffer because our other companies over here are being made to suffer by you. Guess what happened? Everything went away. Tariffs disappeared, the oranges threat disappeared, and everybody got on with their lives. And that's hard-nosed negotiation. That's basically saying, this is not going to happen and we're going to pull out all the stops to make sure it doesn't happen. Now, fast forward 1 year, British Steel. Same guys let's put on 100% tariff on British Steel. And if you go to those same guys and say, we're going to put 100% tariff on your oranges in the UK, when they stop laughing, they're going to say, we don't care. You are a very small, you're about 10% of the EU. We can handle losing 10% because we've still got 90% to sell to, you know. In other words, that's a perfect example of saying even the countries who are our allies will shaft us if there's an opportunity to do so to help them. That's just politics and economics. And if you haven't got 27 other countries behind you saying, hey, listen, there's 500 million of us guys, okay? Then you are fighting a very lonely battle. And those guys won't come to help you because they'll say, yeah, but last year we said stay with us and you said no, we're going to go on our own. So good luck. We've actually taken tariff, reprisals against the EU. They're not the UK, the US. They're not doing it to us. They're just doing it to you. So that is the kind of situation 44% of the country is saying is a good idea. And having seen it myself firsthand, having seen that we've said basically, hey, don't bully us, because if you bully us, we'll bully you back. You have to be big to say that, and the UK is not big enough to say that. That's talking about negotiating with the US, who apparently was, our oldest ally. You can imagine when the Russians and the Chinese come talking, they're not going to give a monkeys, So this really is realpolitik. It's not, realpolitik is that the Americans will turn us over like a squealing pig if it helps them, We're all in this together, unified, and blah, 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 but basically all politics is local, ultimately. Yeah. And you have to make sure that you protect the local through being strong on the international, and that is where 44% of people in the UK are not understanding things.
The target audience for this interview, as I told you, are for young people born since the end of the Cold War. What would you say to them about the relevance of NATO and the broader transatlantic security and defence community to their lives and to their futures?
That's a really tough one, because basically the connection with why everything is here, NATO was 1949, EU 1959. These things took a while to create, but they were created out of the Second World War. Now, why is it difficult? because I still have a connection with the Second World War. My father, my father's father, my grandfather died in the Second World War. So, you know, there's only 2 generations removed. Whereas it'd be your great-grandfather, more of a kind of black and white story, you know, and mists of time. So young people are losing the connection to the utter disaster that was Europe in 1945. The utter, I mean, just have a look on, I was actually looking on YouTube with some aerial shots that were taken of Berlin in July 1945. I mean, there's nothing. There's nothing. This is one of the most vibrant cities in Europe right now. And just have a look at what it looked like just 70, 80 years ago. People are alive today who were alive then. Have a look at what it looked like. That is why NATO is important. That is why the EU is important. Because basically, as you probably know, the EU, before that the European Common Market, was born out of the ESC, European Common Steel and Coal Corporation. So basically what they did was France and Germany put their steel and coal production and use into a joint kind of pot, so that crazies like Hitler and previous people couldn't start saying, well, let's use that steel to make more ships, you know, planes, guns, bombs, whatever. So it had to be, basically it was a kind of death grip that they had on each other. It's like, well, if you do it, I do it, and we both, so let's both not do this. And you talk about that today, or, you know, Boris Johnson talks about these things today, or other pro-Brexit people talk about this today, you know, as well, we want to do our own thing. No, there was a good reason why people weren't doing their own thing. People doing their own thing is what led directly to the Second World War. When people were saying, we're really not interested in what our neighbour is or does. We're just interested in either, you know, taking what they have or using them as an ally to attack somebody else. It's a bit like a sandcastle, you know. You go to the beach and you want to make a really big sandcastle. It's going to take time and effort, and it's not always going to work the first time. But at the end of that, you've achieved something. It's always much more difficult to do something that's positive and takes longer than to do something that's negative. Guy comes along, kicks it over, it's all finished. Okay, that's what we're at the moment. The EU is a big sandcastle that's taken 70 years to work, to become normal, to actually help people. And this is the first time that we're asking one of the people who helped create that, only the second part to be honest with you, we joined the EU quite late, whether they want to kick it down. And for me, that's why I just cannot understand why the numbers have reached 44%, because I don't understand, beyond some misty-eyed, sepia-coloured idea of the British Empire and what we were in the past, and that belonged to different times. It's never coming back, and I think that's what a lot of the 44% are voting for. Bring that back. It's never coming back. It's gone. Let it go. Golden times, different world, not possible anymore. And so, if it's not that, if you explain to them that's not coming back, then the only other justification is ostrich head in the sand approach. You know, if I can't have that back, then I'm not playing this globalization game. I'm not playing this, you know, continental approach where we all benefit game. I'm just going to stick my head in the sand and pretend it's not happening. And again, sorry to keep saying it, but again, I cannot understand how that is a convincing argument for 44% of the population.
What were you saying before about America? For my next question, during his recent state visit to the UK, President Obama appealed to the young UK voters to use their vote in the EU referendum for the next month. As the US is the most important NATO member state, do you think he has the right to do that from a NATO's perspective, or was he, as many, a lot of British people have argued, just interfered in domestic British politics?
I think there's an element there of both sides, and I think, to be fair to him, he did actually say that. He did say, "This is your vote, but we have an interest here," and I don't think he was instructing anybody to do anything that they wouldn't do anyway. But I do think that what he was highlighting is, please understand before you vote. Please understand how this will affect you. And I think that is a very important message. There is, it seems to me, on the Brexit side, very much a kind of yes, but it'll be okay in the end approach.
Yeah.
So whatever you throw at that campaign, they will either dismiss the worries of the people talking to them, or they will try to discredit the person who is talking, which is, typical traditional way of trying to win an argument. I haven't heard them yet come up with something that's actually been interesting. I've been open to hearing what exactly is the killer argument, and I'm still waiting. And I think, frankly, the poverty of their argument is clear, but when they start attacking President Obama, you also think, well, the poverty of your people is becoming clear. Basically, Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF today, has said very similar things. She said that the options for the UK from Brexit vote range from the very bad to the extremely bad. In other words, there is no bright side to this. So when you look at the people who've actually talked about this, you've got President Obama, the leader of the free world. You've got the head of the IMF. Economically, she's sticking her neck on the line by making any pronouncement. And then you've got the leaders of all the main parties. So politically, economically, and geopolitically, there is a unity of agreement that Brexit would be a bad idea. Who have you got on the other side? Farage, Galloway, jokers, basically, populists, people who've never done anything in their life, people who've never been responsible in their life, people who just talk a lot and actually have never actually been responsible for doing anything of any magnitude, let alone of this magnitude, in their lives. I have more respect for people like Nicola Sturgeon, who at least has had to lead a government. I don't agree with her, but I at least think, well, she's responsible for her actions. These are just people blowing hot air, who, again, in themselves are weak. Their arguments are weak, but the environment in which we find ourselves makes their arguments more attractive. And that doesn't mean their arguments are strong, that they're more attractive. It's a bit like Donald Trump, and I don't want to go down that route.
Of course, yeah.
But there is an element now of, don't tell me why it hurts, just tell me it's going to get better. And the person who tells them that is who they're going to vote for. And unfortunately, that's just a blind vote. It's, I heard what I wanted to hear, I don't want to know the details. And unfortunately, that is a growing trend. But in terms of what Obama did, I think he was, in terms of how important this is to the US, he was quite restrained. I think he realised if he actually said how dangerous and damaging this would be, not just to the UK, but to our special relationship. You don't want a special relationship with somebody who's, not even allowed to play with the big kids. He's outside the fence looking in, what use is he? We're talking about the biggest single market in the world, and the biggest economy in the world, and this is big business. This is also, by the way, the majority of the population covered by NATO, which is about 900 million people. And we are thinking that we're important enough, the UK, to walk outside of this and say, yeah, but we're still a big player. I'll just wrap up this answer with this point, which is that I saw some of these internet arguments going backwards and forwards about Brexit and Remain, and one of the rather condescending posts by somebody supporting Brexit was, I think he said, fourth biggest army in the world, or fourth biggest armed forces, fifth biggest economy, I'm sure we'll be fine. Okay. Well, let's deal with the fourth biggest armed forces first. After the first three, there's a huge drop-off, you know. So, and by the way, the US forces are, I think it's their Navy, don't quote me on this, but I think it's their Navy, that is the same size as the next 16 navies combined. And these are 16 countries like Russia, China, you know, these are not small. So I can't overemphasize how world dominant the US military forces are. They are beyond anything we've ever seen before. So on that side, saying fourth biggest army in the world, fourth biggest armed forces in the world, well, yeah, that's not so impressive when you look at compared to the top one or the top two. I mean, you know, if you look at China and the number of men under arms that they can put, dazzling. Not the most professional, not the best equipment, but still dazzling. But that doesn't really matter so much as this part, which is fifth biggest economy in the world. Well, if that goes down the toilet, and let's face it, that's what the prediction is. I mean, I can show you the FT today. Basically, and the Guard has said it, the head of the IMF said, highly likely to trigger a recession, especially in the UK, but maybe even across the EU, and therefore maybe across the world. So that's another reason for not doing it, because basically you're not just hurting yourself, you're hurting the whole world. But anyway, the point is that if you then take a decision to weaken your economy, what do you think happens to the forces? You know, it's already starting to happen anyway with an economy that is coming out of recession. But if you throw it back in again, you bragging about your forces, that's soon going to stop because you won't have the money. So this belief, and just finally on that point, this belief that everything's going to be fine. Well, also ask yourself, under what circumstances did we arrive at these two rather impressive figures? Under being a member of the EU. And as I say, I would invite you to go back to the early 70s when we were taken into the EU and have a look at the terrible state of the UK at that time. I mean, literally, I was a small kid and I remember candles. We had to have candles because there were power cuts. That's the kind of country pre-EU that the UK was. So this belief that we go back to a golden empire if we leave the EU is utter folly.